At 21, Isabella Alvarez believed her world was fragile but safe. Her life fit inside a house that had learned how to hold its breath. Morning light crossed the thin curtains and laid itself carefully on chipped paint, on the small table that had hosted too many hard conversations, on a stack of second-hand books whose spines had softened beneath her hands. The air smelled faintly of coffee, even on days when there were only 2 teaspoons left in the tin and her mother stirred the pot as if memory could thicken water. She told herself that routine was a kind of armor. In the morning she wrote, even when the pages did not want her. In the afternoon she read lines until they quieted the noise that lived just beyond the walls. And at night she practiced a private magic, the delicate act of believing that tomorrow would arrive the same way today had, that the house would continue to exist as an island against tides she did not name. The house itself had a voice. It was not loud, it was patient. The wooden beams loosened sighs when the weather turned. Floorboards ticked under the small footfalls of a life lived carefully. The refrigerator clicked to life and rested again like an old animal. From the street rose the mixed chorus of the neighborhood, vendors who sang prices they could not lower, stray dogs who negotiated territory, buses that inhaled bodies and exhaled fatigue. It all stitched a net of familiarity beneath her feet. Fragile, yes. But safe, because she said it was. And for a time, the world obeyed her small prayer. She did not ignore the whispers. She could not. After midnight, when the last neighbor closed a window and the street lamps threw hard circles of light, her parents' voices slipped under her door and multiplied on the ceiling. Numbers marched through the house like insects, relentless and unembarrassed. Interest was a word that tasted like iron. Deadline was an hour that throbbed beneath every other hour. Sometimes there were names. Men who wore suits in the day and wolves at night. She learned to skip those sentences. She learned to turn a page loudly enough that the sound convinced her she had not heard. Books were a rebellion. She wrote lines that did not owe money to anyone. She built worlds where the worst thing that could happen was sorrow that could be named. She dreamed of binding her words between covers and sending them past the neighborhood, past the city's sleep, into hands that might understand. She wanted a life that was larger, and cleaner, and kinder than the arithmetic of real nights. Safety, she discovered too late, is not a wall. It is a rhythm. And rhythms can be broken with sound. The sound came late, when even the dogs had made peace with the dark. The lamp laid a quiet oval on her notebook. Her father sat at the kitchen table and pretended the numbers could be moved like furniture. Her mother folded a dish towel until it became smaller than its own weave. The first knock landed like weather arriving in one blow. It was not the polite music of a neighbor. It was not the uncertain tapping of someone lost. It struck the door with a certainty that traveled through wood, into hinges, along the bones of the house, until even the lamp glass trembled. Her pen lifted from the page as if it, too, listened. The book on her knee slid to the floor, a soft thud that sounded indecent in the sudden stillness. Silence thickened. The hallway seemed longer. Even the refrigerator forgot its duty. Her breath paused exactly where fear likes to sit. The second knock did not ask again. It measured the house, waited, found it willing to open. The windows offered a thin shiver in answer. The curtain breathed and fell. In the kitchen, her mother's shoulders rose to her ears and stayed there. Her father stood, and the chair feet scraped a long complaint across the tile, small noise, huge sentence. There are moments when the body learns a truth before the mind will admit it. Isabella's hands discovered they were shaking before she understood she was afraid. Her knees learned a language of weakness. Her mouth dried to sand. She told herself it was a mistake, a late delivery, a drunk boy, a wrong address. Her body did not believe her. The third knock ended the conversation. It did not merely strike, it settled. It found a home inside the wood and inside the girl who listened. It carried, within its short echo, the suggestion that time had reached a hinge and would swing. Her father reached the door one heartbeat slower than courage and one heartbeat faster than surrender. His hand hovered, then chose. Hinges confessed. Cold air arrived wearing rain. Men entered first. They had the kind of stillness that grows in men who have learned to wait beside violence and call it employment. Their boots converted the floor into a drumline. Their eyes rehearsed the room, window, lamp, table, girl. They did not touch anything and yet pressed hands onto everything. The house shrank around them. And then the air changed, and she understood that men were only context. Dante Morello stepped over the threshold. His name already lived there, behind the cupboards, inside the stairwell, under the rug where people hide the idea of cash. It existed in rumors that walked faster than buses and in warnings traded in doorways at dusk. He was the city's dark grammar, the rule you learn by breaking once. Some said he ruled streets, others said he ruled nights. Everyone agreed he ruled fear. He did not need to make sound. The room performed silence for him. Even his guards adjusted their distance as if his shadow had been measured by fire. He crossed the small living room with an economy of motion that suggested a man who had taught rooms to obey. He did not hurry. Power never runs, it arrives. Isabella felt him as pressure before she saw him as shape. Her chest tightened as if the air had been told it cost money now. Her heart, surprised into sprinting, found nowhere to go. Her hands wanted to hide and did not know where to put themselves. When his eyes lifted to hers, the rest of the room went out of focus. The gaze was not heat, it was winter, the kind that makes branches snap. She had never been seen this way before, as if every surface of her could be inventoried and none of it required explanation. He did not come for money. This was the thought that arrived hard and sat down. Money is elastic. Money permits tears, allows negotiation, accepts delay in exchange for hope. Money leaves paper trails and the possibility of mercy. He had not brought mercy. He had brought conclusion. The Alvarez debts had grown like mold in a sealed room, quietly, hungrily, everywhere. Interest had taught itself to breed. Deadlines had developed teeth. Her parents had run out of mornings to place between themselves and consequence. So the consequence came at night, wearing a coat and a surname. Dante Morello came to collect what cannot be replaced. Payment in flesh and soul. Payment named Isabella. Her father's face folded into an expression she had not seen before, a geography with too many rivers. Sound left him crooked. He tried to build a dam with words and found that words are not concrete. Her mother's hands found Isabella's arm and clung, not to keep her, but to keep from falling. The air of the room fattened with pleading. Pleading is a language she had read about in books. In the house that night it became weather, persistent, wet, unwelcome, ignored. Dante did not speak for a long time. He watched. Watching, in men like him, is an instrument. He watched until the room rearranged itself around what he already knew would happen. When he finally shook his head, it was not refusal, it was punctuation. He cut the sound of her parents without raising a hand. Some men end sentences with silence. He gave them time, 60 seconds that lasted longer than certain winters. A minute is not long when you are counting it on a clock, it is an ocean when you are drowning in it. The room learned the weight of each heartbeat. The refrigerator thought better of making a noise. Somewhere 2 floors down a neighbor's television whispered a distant argument, and even that humbled itself. Isabella stood in the center of the minute like a small island that understood the tide was not a request. She tried to assemble her life into a shape that could resist. Books stacked on a small shelf. The first story she had ever finished, written at 17, about a girl who chose her own name. The windowsill where seedlings sometimes survived. The sweater that still smelled like shampoo from a winter she had liked. She made a fortress from the smallest stones and found that a fortress built of memory does not stop a man built of decision. When the minute ended, the future arrived. It did not arrive with fanfare. There was no trumpet for the end of a girl. It arrived with a small exhale from her father, a sound that had been following him for years and had finally caught him. It arrived with her mother's eyes collapsing. It arrived because some outcomes are not chosen, they are recognized. Her body learned this first. The earth tilted under her feet in a way that suggested the planet had never been promised to anyone. Her knees negotiated with gravity and lost. Her breath staged a strike. Her heart declared a state of emergency and refused to be calm. She did not fall, people rarely do in real life, but she felt as if the floor had moved a finger width farther away. There was no contract in the room, and still a contract had been signed. Her name slipped its skin and left it on the couch. Isabella Alvarez, the girl who wrote in the mornings and read in the afternoons, the daughter who understood how to carry 3 bags of groceries with 2 hands and 1 smile, she receded into the edges of the lamp's light. In her place stepped a new designation, one with iron in it, one with a key she would never hold. From that night, she was no longer free. From that night, she was what debts make of people when they run out of paper. From that night, she belonged to Dante Morello. The city outside did not pause to witness. Cities are careless with private catastrophes. Across the street, a woman watered plants that did not need it. A bus hissed and dragged its tired lights around a corner. In a 3rd-floor apartment, someone laughed at a joke that would not endure the morning. The neighborhood continued, because neighborhoods must, because stopping would be an admission that the night can take anything it wants. Inside the house, time changed density. Minutes found lead and swallowed it. Her father sat again because standing had betrayed him. Her mother pressed her face to both hands as if she could hold it together. The guards rearranged themselves at the corners of the room, studying entrances, inventing exits, already thinking about the steps between door and car. The lamp finally surrendered and steadied. Isabella looked at the notebooks on the table and tried to imagine how a girl writes after her name is moved. Words had always been bridges, now they looked like ropes. She wondered if sentences could carry weight heavier than a person. She thought perhaps they could, if repeated often enough, if believed without apology. She repeated one now, not to resist the man who had arrived, but to assist the person who would have to continue. You are still here. It was not a shout. It was not even a whisper. It was a statement to her bones. You are still here. It did not change anything. Some truths are good only for holding on, not for changing weather. But holding on is something. It is what people do inside storms they cannot stop, inside rooms they cannot own, inside nights that declare themselves kings. From the threshold, Dante shifted his weight by the smallest measure. Even that had consequence. The room found a new center. A path opened that had not existed a second before. The future is sometimes nothing more than the space created by a man's step. He turned toward the door, and the men turned with him, and the air moved as if it had paid to be allowed. Isabella did not need to be instructed. The instruction was the shape of the room without her in it. She took one step forward and felt the house try to keep her by the sleeve, not with hands, but with every small familiarity that had become skin. She took another, and the house released her because houses know when they cannot argue. On the street, the rain had found purpose. It washed the neighborhood without caring what it erased. The car on the curb had windows that preferred not to be looked through. The night leaned its weight on the roof. She thought of turning her face up and letting the rain rewrite the last 10 minutes into mere weather, but she understood that water does not unwrite iron. As the door closed behind her, the house resettled its joints. It would keep breathing. It would hold her parents like a picture that had lost a color. It would remember her footsteps in particular places and refuse to forget for a long time. Houses do that, Mercy. She did not look back. People in stories do, girls in real nights sometimes cannot. The car door learned her weight. The seat accepted the soaked hem of her jeans. The engine spoke a low promise to distance. The city opened its map to a line she had not chosen. From that night, she was no longer free. From that night, she was a sentence with a period already waiting. From that night, she belonged to the man whose name moved through streets like weather. And somewhere beyond the wiper's steady labor, the future gathered itself in a quiet room with a long table and no music, a ring too heavy for a small hand, and a set of papers that did not care how they were signed. The night knew its work. The night had only just begun. The wedding was not love. It was a corridor laid between two worlds, built from fear and paperwork, lit by bulbs that did not know how to be kind. Morning arrived without asking if she wanted it. It pressed itself against the city and then against the windows of a room that did not belong to her. A dress hung from a hook like a word caught in the throat. White, because tradition likes to dress violence and innocence. White, because stories say white means beginning, even when it is a burial wearing perfume. Isabella woke inside a body that kept repeating no without sound. The mirror held her shape as if the glass were a witness called to testify against her. The skin beneath her eyes had learned the color of bad nights. Her hands, obedient traders, buttoned what someone else had laid out, smoothed the fabric that did not want to be smoothed, arranged the veil that turned the world into fog. She had been dressed before, by her mother, for small rituals, school photos, a borrowed graduation, a distant cousin's Sunday mass, and those fabrics had known how to make space for breath. This one measured her like a tape that lies. It promised grace and delivered restraint. Outside, the morning rode on tires. Engines hummed like insects too large to swat away. Men stood in doorways and learned not to stare. The air carried rain that did not fall yet but intended to. The city squinted at the sun and preferred not to speak. They moved her through rooms that smelled of polish and expense, down a staircase that had been built to teach footsteps how to behave. The house where she had slept was not the house where she had lived. It had too much marble to be honest. It swallowed sound and returned to your own breathing as proof you existed. In the foyer, a man checked a watch that measured obedience more accurately than time. Somewhere, a phone vibrated and learned again how to be silent. The car waited, slick and reflective. It did not need to be black to tell the truth, but it was. Doors opened like statements. She sat, and the seat accepted her with polite indifference. Her hem pulled like light around her knees. Through the glass, the world thinned into a moving painting, laundromats confessing their fluorescent fatigue, women sweeping stoops that had learned to keep secrets, a fruit cart that kept insisting sweetness could survive economics. She catalogued these ordinary survivals the way a person gathers pebbles before crossing water, small, useless, precious. The courthouse, or whatever that building preferred to be called, rose with the impersonal confidence of institutions that had outlived 100 winters. Stone learned how to be smooth from the hands that touched it only to pass by. Steps led to doors that knew too much. The threshold carried the memory of feet that had entered with hope and left without it. Inside, light came from above, from a grid of fixtures humming like tired bees. The air was obediently conditioned. It made skin cool and spine straighter. There was no aisle, not the kind that flower girls dream about. There was a corridor without windows and then a room that did not wait for happiness to arrive before beginning. A table had been chosen for its ability to lie flat. 2 chairs faced each other because customs prefer symmetry. The walls were painted the color of almost white, the tone used when decorators want to remove personality from space. A fern tried to live under those lights and succeeded badly. Paper formed a careful stack that looked harmless until you remembered that ink has a will to power. Men arranged themselves as corners. Not guards exactly, not guests, not witnesses, but geometry that taught the room where its edges were. Their eyes traveled corridors no one else could see, and their arms did not forget where weapons slept. The atmosphere did what it is trained to do around power, it learned to be still. She stood in white. The veil made the world a thin softness and then refused to soften anything that mattered. She thought of her mother's hands, of the way they would have fixed a strand of hair that did not obey, of how they would have kissed her cheek even if the lipstick smudged, of how they would have whispered a nonsense blessing learned from a grandmother who had learned it from someone who never wrote. That would have been a wedding. This was a notarization of a decision made elsewhere. He entered the way weather enters, by already being present when you notice it. Dante Morello did not wear celebration. He wore inevitability. The suit did not alter his temperature. The room recalibrated around him as an object recalibrates when gravity asserts itself. He approached the table with the unhurried economy of a man who spends neither coin nor gesture without return. He did not touch her. Touch implies question, he dealt in answers. The officiant, if that is the right word for a functionary who has learned to keep adjectives out of his work, sat with a spine that had signed documents for 20 years. The face said nothing. The hands positioned papers the way a surgeon positions instruments. The pen lay diagonally across the top page, task and tool in one small length of plastic. The speech crafted by law moved forward without asking for applause. Words like union and consent behaved politely, which is to say, they did not announce the violence they can carry when stripped of meaning. Isabella heard part of it. Another part dissolved under the pressure of blood in her ears. She felt her own pulse misbehave. She felt the dress grow heavier as if seconds were beads being sewn into the hem. She felt the ring before it happened, a ghost circlet around her finger, burning with a fire so cold it had not been invented yet. She stared at a point just beyond the officiant's left shoulder where paint had been patched. A rectangle several shades off told a story of a sign once removed. Her mind climbed into that lighter patch of wall the way a child climbs into a parent's lap, refuge by invention. The pen in her hand weighed more than she did. She signed. The curve of her first name did not look like the one she had practiced in margins. The last name was not hers until the ink dried, and then it was. The transformation happened invisibly, the way a seed becomes a root in dark soil. A person becomes a possession not all at once but in strokes, and then a clerk stamps a seal, and the metamorphosis finds its paperwork. The ring, when it came, was the opposite of delicate. It had a crest that had meaning to men who met in rooms where curtains were thick and names were treated like property. The metal was honest about its weight. It did not pretend to be romance. It slid down her finger and announced a new gravity. Her skin did not redden, exactly, it learned a new temperature. She lifted her hand a fraction to see whether the symbol would look smaller from a different angle. Symbols do not change size for the comfort of the wearer. A camera clicked. Not the celebratory burst of a wedding album. A single capture, functional, clinical, an image to place in a file if a file needed a face. She saw the flash inside her own head and wondered whether that was how ghosts are made, by light arriving where it is not wanted and freezing a person into a version of themselves that cannot move. The men who had been corners remained corners. The officiant gathered papers with hands that did not tremble. The pen returned to its diagonal. A stamp left a bruise of ink that would not heal. Someone coughed, the kind of cough that apologizes for existing. Somewhere in the building, a copier sang its short, flat into bureaucracy. She did not faint. People rarely do, however suitable fainting would be to certain scenes. She stood because standing was the floor's instruction. She breathed because breath refuses to sign contracts, even when bodies do. The veil turned and caught on the chair's arm as if at the last second some fabric wished to rebel. She freed it and learned again how to let go of what wants to hold her. It ended the way official things end, with no ceremony at all. The room released them back into the hallway like a mouth that had completed chewing. No applause, no rice, no relatives throwing confetti made from blessings. Only the shift of weight in shoes, the practical squeak of buffed floors, the clearing of a throat, the sound of air that belongs to everyone and to no one. The corridor outside had the length of small eternities. It collected footsteps and returned them as evidence. The fluorescent lights hummed a note that put nerves on edge. Doors on either side wore small placards announcing names that were neither comforting nor cruel, just administrative. From somewhere deeper in the building came the muted excitement of a child who did not understand yet that some rooms are for discipline, not delight. A vending machine blinked through its own loneliness. She walked. One step, then the next, then another. She counted because numbers do not lie to you when you keep them small. Every 10 steps, she repeated the same sentence, "You are still here." It stayed true each time, and truth brought with it a tiny square of floor that did not tilt. He walked a pace ahead, not turning. Not demanding. Not offering. Not anything. Presence was the only verb he needed to conjugate. Men at the ends of the corridor adjusted their posture to the weather of him. The building had already learned his barometric pressure. She moved inside that pressure the way a leaf moves inside a current, by belonging to the motion that carries it. Outside, the rain had decided. It came straight and serious, erasing chalk and scolding dust. The stone steps shone. People took shelter under lintels that had known enough to be broad. The car came forward smoothly, well-trained, and stopped where stopping meant the least inconvenience to the world that mattered. Doors made themselves available. Before sitting, she looked down at her dress. Water had freckled the hem into a pattern that would dry into nothing. She thought of stains that do not dry into nothing, memories, signatures, rings, how they remain even when the world insists on moving forward. She gathered the skirt because that is what skirts asked to have done. The ring caught the gray light and insisted on being seen. She let it. Refusing to look at a thing does not make it smaller. Inside the car, the air smelled of leather, of routines that cost money, of the faint citrus that chauffeurs learned to prefer. The city passed, and she tried to memorize it as if she might need it later. The man repairing a sign with a letter missing, the dog that had claimed the exact center of a crosswalk as its bed, the billboard offering a vacation to a place where the water was too blue to be believed. She placed these things in a drawer in her mind, labeled for after, even though she understood after is a continent some never reach. They did not drive home because she did not have a home anymore, she had a destination. The mansion did not pretend to be modest. It unfolded its wings as if the arriving car were a ceremony and had been promised. Gardens had been arranged to look as if nature had chosen them. Gravel obeyed tires as only expensive gravel can. Lights glowed the way old money glows, less like brightness, more like authority confiding in itself. She crossed the threshold as a name she did not recognize in her own mouth. The foyer was a lesson in how to articulate height. The chandelier had been hung to convince the human neck to tilt. Floors believed in reflections. Art observed her with the superiority of frames. A staircase offered choices that were not choices, left to the life intended, right to the life enforced. She stood there long enough for time to feel the disrespect and move on anyway. A woman with practiced hands showed her a room where a mirror waited. The mirror refused to be an accomplice and chose instead to be a witness again. She removed the veil. It came away the way fog burns off a field, not angrily, not quickly, just by remembering that warmth exists somewhere. Pins discovered gravity. Hair reclaimed its honest shape. She touched the place on her finger where the ring had pressed a new history into skin. The mark would outlive the day. Perhaps that was the point of rings. She sat on the edge of a bed that had never been slept in by a person who worried about bills. The mattress rose to meet her as if trying to be kind and managing only to be expensive. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and let her head hang the way heads do when they are too heavy to wear. Breath in. Hold. Breath out. The old discipline of living inside a body that insists on continuing. She counted backward from a number that meant nothing. At 0, there was still a room. What does a person do the hour after a life has been renamed? She looked at the wardrobe and imagined dresses that needed new postures. She looked at the window and imagined the perimeter of a freedom drawn in invisible ink on the lawn beyond. She looked at the door and imagined footsteps that would not be hers, choosing whether to stop there or pass by. In each imagining, she remained a noun when she had once hoped to be a verb. She stood and walked to the window. The rain had eased into a whisper. The garden below wore droplets like sequins, and the fountain in the center performed circular arguments for no one. Beyond, the city remembered how to be itself. It was comforting and cruel to watch people continue. Comforting, because the world did not end when she did. Cruel, because if the world can survive your ending, it will not come back to fetch you. On the low table by the window, a book waited as if placed for a photograph. It was heavy in the way books are when they have been bought for their binding. She opened it not for the sentences, there were few, but for the act of opening. Inside, a pressed flower flattened by someone else's past sighed into the air. It smelled of a summer that belonged to strangers. She closed the book gently, as if not to wake a memory. The day continued under its own power. Somewhere in the house, staff performed their rituals, silver learning to be bright again, linen relearning its corners, kitchen air cataloging herbs. Somewhere else, a room organized numbers that controlled other rooms. Somewhere else, men discussed storms in voices that had taught lightning manners. The house worked around her the way tides work around stones. She found the small bathroom adjoining the room and washed her hands as if soap could argue with ink. Water ran over knuckles, found the ring, hesitated, continued. She watched the droplets cling to the crest and thought of how water has patience human beings do not. It will wear down mountains. It will learn the inside of a name. It will find its level no matter how many times you ask it not to. In the mirror again, she said nothing. Words would have been a violence against the quiet she needed to survive the hour. She lifted her chin because posture can be a prayer. She placed the veil in a drawer because hiding a thing is sometimes the only way to make space for breath. She positioned the ring so it lay straight because chaos should not be invited, and then she opened the door because doors are for that. Corridors stretched with the grace of wealth. Art followed her progress without moving. She felt the house observe her the way a museum observes a visitor who cannot afford the gift shop. At the top of the stairs, she paused, not for effect, not for fear, but because standing at the hinge of a descent asks a question: who will you be at the bottom? She descended. At the foot, the floor answered by being floor. She crossed the foyer and learned its echoes. She entered a dining room vast enough to hold an argument between centuries. The table could seat a council, today it seated distance. At one end sat the man whose name now traveled with hers. At the other, a place had been laid that would teach her the choreography of utensils. This was not a meal. It was an introduction to a climate. He ate like a person who had taught hunger to respect boundaries. She ate like a person who wanted to remember how to be a person. Between them lay polished wood in the version of silence that wears uniform. She did not watch him, not directly. She watched the space he created, the way air learned to behave, the slight shift in the room's attention when he lifted a glass. When she lifted hers, nothing shifted. She noted the difference not as self-pity but as data. A map requires points, she was collecting them. When it ended as all ceremonies in this world seemed to, cleanly, without vocabulary. She stood because he stood. She moved because the room turned in that direction. She returned to the window and found the rain considering itself again. She knew what story the city would tell about today, a union that secured an empire, a woman made powerful by a ring, a man made legitimate by a vow. Stories choose their angles based on who holds the light. Inside the room, another story had been etched on bone. A girl signed away her name because debts had teeth and came at night, and men owned corridors that led to rooms where pens learned how to end people. From that day, she carried not just a ring but an architecture. From that day, she wore not only a dress but a geography. From that day, she was not a bride. She was a border. Isabella Alvarez had been folded and placed between pages that would not open again. Isabella Morello stood at a window and practiced the most dangerous discipline, remaining. Sometimes shackles are invisible. They feel like air until you try to run. Sometimes vows are cages that applaud themselves. Sometimes a name is a door that opens only in one direction. From that day, she no longer belonged to herself. From that day, she belonged to the empire of a man who did not need to touch her to hold her. From that day, she learned the first rule of survival in a house that thinks it is a country: breathe, count, stand. And somewhere beneath the sound of careful rain, a piano considered a single note and chose not to play it yet. The mansion was vast. Vast in the way oceans are vast, not merely large, but endless to the eyes of those who do not belong. For Isabella, it did not look like safety. It looked like a verdict carved into stone. The iron gates opened without sound, heavy enough that silence itself strained beneath them. The car passed through, and she felt the world shrink behind her. Gravel crunched with the precision of rehearsed footsteps. Gardens spread on either side, trimmed into geometries that nature would never choose on her own. Statues guarded fountains, and fountains performed their endless rehearsals of water meeting water, a performance without audience or applause. The house rose at the end of the drive, more palace than dwelling. Windows glared down like watchmen. Balconies stretched outward like wings of a creature pretending to welcome but ready to cage. The roof glittered with tiles imported from countries Isabella had only read about. To someone else, this might have been wonder. For her, it was warning. Inside, the air was colder. The marble swallowed the warmth from her shoes. Chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, their crystals waiting for light they did not need. The staircase divided itself in two, curling upward as if to present her to a destiny she had not requested. On the walls, portraits followed her, men with stern jaws, women with lips pressed shut, children painted to look like heirs, not like children. The staff moved quietly, shadows wearing uniforms. They bowed their heads, not in respect, but in fear. Their silence was practiced, each gesture stripped of individuality. Isabella caught their eyes only once or twice, and even then, the gaze darted away like a moth from flame. Every corridor whispered of power and danger. Every polished surface repeated the same truth: she was not free. Her room was prepared long before she arrived. It was larger than the entire Alvarez home. A bed heavy with velvet covers. A wardrobe lined with dresses she had never chosen. Curtains thick enough to strangle the daylight. A balcony overlooking gardens that seemed to laugh at the word escape. The window glass was thick, stronger than it looked. She touched the bed and felt no comfort. She opened the wardrobe and found no choice. She leaned against the balcony rail and saw not freedom, but a perimeter patrolled by guards. Their black suits cut through the green like stains. They were not there to protect her. They were there to prevent her from forgetting she was owned. At night, the house did not sleep. It breathed. Wood shifted with age. The wind crawled through narrow slits. Somewhere deep below, she thought she heard the hum of generators, the thrum of machinery keeping the empire alive. She lay awake, counting the cracks in the ceiling, each one another bar in the invisible cage. Her days became repetition. Dawn began with a knock, always the same, always precise. A tray of food, bread too soft, fruit too perfect, coffee too bitter. She ate little, never enough to be grateful, never so little as to provoke. The maids dressed her in silence. Fabrics slid over her skin like cold water. She was displayed in silk and lace as though her body were a mannequin in someone else's boutique. She walked the halls when permitted, always shadowed. Guards watched her as if she were both precious and dangerous. Cameras blinked in corners, eyes that never slept. Every movement felt measured, recorded, catalogued. At dinner, the ritual repeated. The long table, the silver that gleamed like knives. Dante sat at one end, she at the other. Food arrived, delicate and excessive, flavors she could not taste past the knot in her throat. He ate with discipline, cutting, lifting, chewing with the patience of a man who had never been denied. His silence was not absence. It was command. Sometimes he spoke. A word, a question, a sentence that sounded less like curiosity and more like verdict. His voice carried no need to rise. Power does not raise itself to be heard. She answered because silence would not protect her. She answered because refusal was not an option. She hated him. She hated the way his eyes found her and refused to let go. She hated the way the house bent around him, obeying without being asked. She hated that he had turned her life into something that belonged to him without ever raising his voice. And yet, hate was complicated. Because curiosity had begun to grow inside her, traitorous and persistent. The mansion carried secrets. At night, when the house exhaled and even the guards softened into stillness, Isabella wandered in her mind. She imagined the locked rooms, the corridors she had not yet walked. She wondered about the doors that remained closed, the safes behind paintings, the papers hidden in drawers. But above all, she wondered about him. Once, she woke in the dark and left her room, padding silently through the halls until she saw him. Dante Morello, standing alone by a window, unmoving. His figure was carved by moonlight, broad shoulders outlined against the glass. He did not notice her, or perhaps he did and chose not to reveal it. His head bowed slightly, his posture carrying a weight she had no name for. He stayed that way long enough for her to feel the strangeness of seeing him human, not myth. Another time, she heard him speaking to a man in hushed tones. Loyalty, betrayal, trust, war, the words floated like smoke under her door. His voice faltered once, not in fear, but in something heavier, something Isabella could not identify. She pressed her hand against the wood and felt the vibration of a man who carried not just power, but the exhaustion of it. For the world, Dante Morello was a monster. For Isabella, he was still a monster. But a monster who sometimes stood too long at windows, who sometimes let a scar tell its story, who sometimes carried silence not as a weapon, but as a wound. She despised him. She despised herself for noticing. And yet, when she closed her eyes at night, she remembered those glimpses, the shadow at the glass, the weight in his voice, the scars his hands could not ignore. She began to ask questions she should never have asked. Who had hurt him? What had made him this way? Was there a boy once, long before the name Morello became legend, who wanted something other than blood? Her heart whispered traitorous answers. Her body remembered the burn of his gaze. Her mind clung to hate, but hate was slippery when tangled with curiosity. The mansion was a cage. But cages are not only built of stone and bars. They are also built of contradictions, of fear that becomes fascination, of hate that trembles into longing, of chains that sometimes feel like arms. Days turned into weeks. And weeks in captivity do not march like soldiers, they stretch like shadows, long, uneven, each one heavier than the last. Isabella measured time not by calendars but by repetition, the knock at dawn, the tray of food, the dresses she did not choose, the corridors patrolled by men who never smiled. At first, hate was simple. Hate was a fire that burned bright, that gave her the illusion of resistance. She whispered it to herself at night, I hate him. I hate him. I hate him. She said it like a prayer. She said it like a shield. She said it because it was the only truth she thought she had left. But hate is never simple when it is forced to share a room with silence. Hate needs fuel, and silence eats fuel slowly. She began to notice him. Not because she wanted to, but because she could not stop herself. At the table, she noticed the way his hand lingered for a second over a scar that crossed his palm. She wondered what story it told, who had left it there, what moment of violence had been etched into his flesh. She noticed the way his voice deepened when he spoke of loyalty, the faint tremor it carried when betrayal was named. He never spoke directly to her about these things, yet his words were weighted with the iron of a past she had never seen. She noticed how he stood by the window at night, the city lights painting his face in fragments. Sometimes his reflection looked more human than the man himself. His shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching. His eyes searched the skyline not as a ruler surveying his territory, but as a prisoner searching for exits that no longer existed. She hated that she noticed. She hated that her mind built questions where she had promised only answers. The mansion itself betrayed her. It forced her into proximity with him, again and again. The corridors were long, but the silence carried footsteps like whispers. She would hear him before she saw him, his stride steady, unhurried, inevitable. The dining room was wide, but the space between them always felt too narrow. The air seemed thinner in his presence, forcing her to breathe his rhythm instead of her own. And so curiosity grew, quiet and poisonous. She began to imagine his childhood. A boy born into fire, molded by blood, taught to hold knives before pens. She wondered if he had ever laughed freely, if there had been a moment when he believed in something softer than survival. She pictured him as a child with scraped knees and wide eyes, and then she pictured how quickly that child must have been buried. Dante Morello never shared his past. But Isabella pieced it together from fragments, scars that spoke louder than words, silences that lasted too long, eyes that searched too far. She fought herself. In the darkness of her room, she repeated, I hate him. I hate him. I hate him. But the words felt weaker each night. Hate is loud at first, but eventually it tires of echoing against the same walls. And there were moments, small, traitorous moments, when hate trembled. When his eyes softened, for just a second, as they met hers across the table. When his voice dropped, not in command, but in something almost like hesitation. When his hand brushed the edge of hers, not by intention, but by accident, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as they should have. Her heart began to betray her. It refused to obey her mind. It refused to hold hate without letting something else slip in. She began to dream. Not of escape, as before, but of him. Dreams where his hands were not chains but shelter. Dreams where his silence was not a weapon but a wound. Dreams where she asked him who he was before the world demanded he become Dante Morello, and he answered with something fragile, something human. She woke from those dreams trembling, ashamed, furious at herself. She pressed her palms against her chest, as though she could smother the heart that betrayed her. Because she still hated him. She hated what he had taken, what he had broken, what he had claimed. She hated him for being her captor. But she hated herself more for wondering what it would feel like if he were not. The mansion mirrored her conflict. Its halls grew tighter. Its portraits looked more alive. Its windows offered less light. She felt as though the walls themselves knew what she was feeling, as though they mocked her for the betrayal growing inside her chest. Sometimes, she thought she saw pity in the eyes of the maids. Other times, she saw only fear. Perhaps they, too, had learned what it meant to live close to a man who carried both ruin and safety in his hands. For the world, Dante Morello was a monster. For Isabella, he was still a monster. But monsters are complicated when they bleed. She told herself she hated him. She whispered it every night like a prayer she was no longer sure anyone was listening to. She repeated it like a shield that had begun to crack. Because sometimes hate is just love wearing a mask. Sometimes hate is only fear refusing to call itself by another name. And in the silence of the mansion, in the echo of footsteps, in the weight of his gaze, her mask began to slip. The illusion shattered the night the Cuervos came. It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of waiting, the kind that fills a house when the walls themselves know something is about to break. Isabella felt it before it began. A tremor in the air. The faintest flicker of unease in the way the guards shifted their weight, in the way the maids whispered shorter prayers. Even Dante seemed sharper that day, his movements tighter, his eyes watching not just her, but the world beyond the windows. The night was heavy. The chandeliers burned too brightly. The dinner tasted like metal. The city lights outside blinked as if warning her. Isabella lay in bed, unable to sleep, her body restless without reason she could name. Then it came. The sound that tore the illusion apart. Glass. Shattering. A scream from somewhere in the distance, cut short. The staccato rhythm of boots striking marble. And then, the roar of gunfire. The Cuervos had arrived. They spilled into the mansion like shadows with teeth, their faces hidden behind masks painted with snarls. Their weapons gleamed in the artificial light. They moved with precision, with hunger, with hatred sharpened into ritual. The guards met them at the door. The first shots cracked like thunder, echoing down the corridors. Isabella pressed herself against her door, trembling as the sound grew closer, louder, more violent. She heard men shouting in Spanish, orders, curses, promises of blood. Her room door burst open. Hands grabbed her. Rough, merciless hands. A cloth pressed against her mouth. Her scream was muffled, her body dragged across the floor. The walls of the mansion blurred as they pulled her into the darkness, past fallen bodies, past fires that had begun to eat at the curtains. She kicked, she clawed, but her strength was nothing. They bound her wrists, they blindfolded her, and the world became only fear. For the first time, Isabella understood what it meant to be Dante Morello's wife. She was no longer just a prisoner of his world. She was the weak point in it. They dragged her through halls she knew and into spaces she had never seen, back corridors, service tunnels, the bowels of the house. Her bare feet scraped against concrete. Voices buzzed around her like hornets, laughing, threatening, promising what they would do. And she thought, this is the end. Not his hands, not his cage, not his chains. But theirs. And then the world erupted again. Dante had come. The sound of his arrival was not quiet. It was the thunder of doors breaking, the storm of bullets carving through walls. His name was a curse on the Cuervos' lips, shouted in rage, in disbelief, in fear. Isabella, bound and blindfolded, felt the shift in the air. A presence heavier than the weapons, more suffocating than the ropes on her wrists. Dante moved through the house not like a man, but like the storm itself. Gunfire painted the night. Men screamed, fell, crawled, begged. Dante did not beg. Dante did not crawl. He carved his way through them, each shot an oath, each wound a declaration. The blindfold slipped. Isabella saw glimpses through the chaos. A figure drenched in shadows and blood. A face carved with fury, eyes burning with something she could not name. Hands that killed with the same ease they once held a glass of wine. And yet, those hands reached for her. When he found her, his body carried fresh wounds, his shirt torn and soaked in crimson. His breath came ragged, but his grip on her arms was unyielding. He cut the ropes, pulled her close, shielded her with his body as bullets split the air around them. "Run," someone shouted. But Dante did not run. He moved forward, dragging her with him, tearing through walls of fire and smoke, until the mansion itself seemed to bow to his rage. She stumbled, cried out, clung to him. And for the first time, she felt the most terrifying thing of all. Safety. When they reached the last room, when the last Cuervo fell, Dante collapsed. His knees struck marble, his hand gripping her arm even as his strength bled into the floor. His chest heaved, blood spilling from wounds too deep, too many. And Isabella fell with him. Her hands cradled his face, her tears mixing with the blood on his skin. He looked at her, not as a possession, not as a debt, not as a trophy, but as something else. Something raw. In that moment, she forgot hate. She forgot chains. She forgot everything but the weight of his body in her arms and the unbearable truth blooming in her chest. For the first time, she was safe in the arms of the man she once called a monster. After war, rooms do not return to being rooms. They keep the echo of what they saw the way a body keeps the echo of a blow. The mansion tried to restore its symmetry, carpet stretched, glass replaced, corners perfumed into forgetting, but forgetting is a labor that houses and people never finish. The night had left fingerprints where flames had lit the curtains, it had taught the walls a new vocabulary. Even the air had changed density. It moved slower, heavier, as if smoke had left instructions for how to breathe. Isabella woke in a bed that had learned the outline of fear. She woke with the kind of tired that does not ask for sleep, only for quiet. Outside the window, the garden pretended to be innocent, a sheen of water on trimmed hedges, leaves glinting like coins, a fountain arguing with itself. Morning light insisted that this was a new day. Her body answered that time is not a calendar but a wound. She remembered hands, rough and certain. She remembered ropes giving way. She remembered the way halls had narrowed to the width of a man who refused to fall. And then she remembered weight, the collapse that was not surrender but the consequence of too much standing. She remembered blood. Not the color first, but the temperature in her palms. She remembered the knowledge that had arrived with terror. He had come for her because there was no world in which he would not. The corridor outside her room had learned silence so carefully that every step she took felt like an apology. She moved toward the guest wing where the house hid its injuries. A door stood half closed, a curtain stirred without a breeze, water whispered in a basin. She paused at the threshold not from fear but from the respect one gives an altar. Then she entered. He lay on the bed as if the bed had decided to carry him the way men carry fallen comrades. Bandages crossed his ribs like the white lines of roads on a map. Someone had cut away the shirt in the night, leaving only the necessary. The saint at his throat had been placed on the table, its metal had lost its face to years of fingers. On the chair, a jacket hung heavy with a new stiffness, the way fabric learns a different language after it meets blood. She washed her hands because ritual is sometimes the only bridge between chaos and action. On the counter waited gauze, iodine, a bowl of water that forgot to be warm. There was also an ice pack that had learned other bruises long ago, and a torn photograph that kept half a mouth and half a jaw and all of a silence. She did not turn the photo over. Some truths do not need to look both ways. She worked carefully, as if each touch might wake a sleeping city. She peeled old tape with patience, replaced dressings that had taken the shape of red. She pressed the cloth where a bullet had argued with bone and bone had chosen not to break. The body on the bed responded with the involuntary language of pain, a breath that stuttered, a muscle that forgot its pride. His eyes opened once and found the ceiling, as if ceiling and sky could be convinced to trade places. Then they lowered to her hands, and for a small eternity the world contained only the distance between skin and bandage. Kindness can be a weapon. It can also be an oath. Hers was both. She did not speak. Words felt like furniture in a room that needed space. She replaced them with gestures, the measured pressure of fingers, the refusal to hurry, the way she held a shoulder not to claim it but to keep it from floating away. If he watched her, he did it the way a soldier watches a horizon, without moving, as if movement might cost more than he had left. Outside, the house recalculated. Men walked softer, doors remembered to close themselves, radios kept their voices on a leash. The blue wing, sealed since the beginning, remained latched, a quiet mouth holding back a sentence. Isabella had learned not to test that latch. Some boundaries are not walls, they are mirrors. When the last bandage lay flat and sure, she sat. Not on the bed, not at his side, on the floor, back to the wall, knees drawn up, head resting against a surface that refused to soften. Her palms still held the memory of heat. She kept them open, as if cooling them would cool the part of her that had reached too far. Desire is a patient animal. It does not leap, it circles. It learns the perimeter of a room, the pattern of someone's breathing, the time it takes for a hand to lift, the time it takes for a hand to drop. It wears the clothes of gratitude. It smells like survival. It comes close enough to be mistaken for mercy. She told herself the old sentences, I hate him. I hate what he took. I hate the name that sits on my tongue like iron. The words arrived obediently, lined up as soldiers. And yet they did not advance. Behind them, another army formed, one made of the memory of being cut free, of being pulled through fire by a man who refused to leave her behind even when blood asked him to. And then came the most treacherous battalion, the knowledge of how his weight had felt when he collapsed into her. The contact had been accidental, unavoidable, necessary, and yet her body had recognized it with the terrible relief that belongs to the word safe. Days in a house after war are made of after. After the shouting, after the smoke, after the sirens that never arrive because some wars phone no one. The staff collected fragments of night and placed them in plastic, then in bins, then in unknowable places. The corridors acquired new marks, a nick at hip height on a doorframe, a circle of paler paint where something hot had leaned too long, a patch of floor polished half a shade darker than the rest. When she walked, she knew which tile remembered a foot that would never step again. She returned to the guest room at intervals nobody scheduled. The body on the bed performed the arithmetic of healing, fever one day, sleep the next, pain announcing itself in different dialects as the hours turned. Sometimes a doctor arrived with a bag that looked older than the man who carried it. Sometimes a different man stood at the window and did not pretend to be anything but a guard. Isabella learned their faces without learning their names. Names tie you to people, faces are safer. She learned the map of his wounds. A line at the rib cage where a bullet had skimmed as if reminded at the last second that bone is stubborn. A deeper cut at the flank that insisted on attention, as certain injuries do, not because they are the worst, but because they want to be remembered. The palm scar she had noticed at dinner, a pale crescent like a new moon, grew larger when seen up close, as old things do when you look at them honestly. When fever came, it came without theater. Heat lifted off his skin and made the room smaller. He did not thrash or moan. He endured. Endurance is the music of men like him, they play it when others sleep. She changed the cloth on his forehead with the same rhythm men reload magazines, steady, sure, without asking whether this is the last one. In the basin, water remembered hands. On the table, the saint watched without a face. At dusk on the third day, the house breathed differently. A window somewhere accepted evening, the garden turned its green into a darker thing. Isabella opened the curtains a fraction because light has its own medicine. On the chair, the jacket drooped further, its shoulders remembering the man who had filled them. She touched the torn photograph without meaning to. The paper yielded the way old paper yields, resisting first, then surrendering with a sigh. The half-mouth had the beginning of a smile that might have been tenderness or might have been wind. She closed her fingers around the image until the corner pressed a small triangle into her palm. What she felt then was not pity. Pity is condescension in costume. What she felt was recognition of a fracture, of a history that nobody had repaired because power rarely believes it needs a cast. A thought came without asking: if a person is built from wounds and will, what happens when one of those wounds is touched not as a target but as a truth? She placed the photo back and stood very still, so still that the room's smallest sounds introduced themselves. Cloth whispering as it dried. Would remembering an old winter. A breath that caught and changed instructions midair. He was awake. Not entirely, not boastfully, but awake in the way injured men wake, by checking whether the world still exists before allowing themselves into it. His gaze found her like a compass. There was no command in it. No demand. Only awareness, and under awareness, the question people ask when they do not know how to ask: am I still the person who decided to survive? She moved closer because distance would have been unkind. She surveyed the bandages because bandages are a language and she had learned enough to read basics. One corner had lifted, she pressed it back with care. Her fingers met his skin and did not retreat quickly. The room did not scold her for that. Desire, then, took one step out of its circle. Not a leap. Not a claim. A step. She felt it as heat, as a pulse that did not belong to fever, as the ache of a door that has been shut too long and decides to test its hinge. She did not confuse it with love. Love is a word the world uses to explain to itself why people hold hands in fires. This was simpler and more complicated. This was a body asking for a language that would not bruise. She sat at the edge of the bed because standing had become a kind of lie. Her weight made a small valley in the mattress that sloped toward his. Gravity is a quiet conspirator. Their hands lay close enough to notice the distance. She counted heartbeats because numbers gave shape to waiting. On 4, his fingers shifted. On 6, hers did. By 8, they had found each other without ceremony. Touch can be a treaty. It can also be a truce. Theirs was both, and neither. It was an acknowledgement that two people existed in the same air and had survived the same night and had learned, unjustly, that sometimes safety arrives wearing a face you promised to hate. She did not lean in. He did not pull her closer. The room held them, and they allowed it. Outside, the garden rehearsed the evening. Somewhere, a piano considered a single note and chose silence again. The house, which had been designed to show the world what power looks like when it polishes itself, looked away for once. She stayed until sleep softened his mouth into something almost young. Then she slid her hand free, not to end a moment but to protect it from becoming less. She rose, stretched the ache from her spine, and placed the saint back beside the bandages with a small respect that had nothing to do with belief and everything to do with history. In the corridor, night had replaced afternoon without asking her opinion. She walked it like a person who has returned from a border. The portraits watched and, for once, did not judge. In the library, she passed the portrait of the unknown woman and did not look away. Under the frame, dust had settled evenly again. She smiled at dust the way one smiles at a witness who keeps your secrets. Her room greeted her with the neutrality of expensive things. She undressed with the method of a soldier, folded fabric with the gentleness of a daughter, washed her hands until heat gave way to cool. In the mirror, a girl stood who was no longer inventing sentences to endure men. She was learning a different grammar, the kind that conjugates presence and costs. She lay down and did not sleep. She allowed herself the luxury of not deciding what any of this meant. Between love and hate exists a valley where language goes to drink water and return without an opinion. She camped there and listened to her heart learn a new rhythm. She repeated a sentence not as rebellion, not as surrender, but as truth. I am still here. Morning rearranged the mansion. The smell of coffee returned, shy but functioning. Linen rediscovered its corners. Men who had not died practiced being alive by talking about gates and schedules. Isabella moved through it all as if through a museum of the recently avoided. She placed one foot in front of the other and gave the day a chance to choose her. In the guest room, fever had broken. The skin under her palm again belonged to a climate the body recognizes. He had slept and woken and slept again, and in those cycles something had been negotiated that did not require witnesses. She changed bandages and thought of the way stories change when the bleeding stops, not by becoming soft, but by becoming clear. He watched her again, this time with the steadiness of a man who has measured the cost and intends to pay it anyway. There was, around his eyes, the faintest loosening, as if the muscle that holds the mask had allowed the face beneath to breathe. She did not mistake that for gentleness. She understood it as room. A few inches of air in which possibility could stand up. Desire was there, still patient. It did not press. It did not bargain. It understood that what had grown between them was too expensive to spend quickly. She placed the roll of gauze on the table and, without looking at him, lifted her hand and rested it lightly on his forearm. It was not permission she asked for. It was witness. In that small, measured contact lay a truth she would later be able to speak, that she had crossed the first distance. Not from hate to love. From isolation to recognition. From being an object in someone else's empire to being a person in her own skin beside a man who, for one night, had chosen her life over the ease of letting go. After war, rooms do not return to being rooms. Sometimes, if cared for, they become places where two people can remain without needing to win. She left him there, not because leaving was easy, but because staying every second would have been theft, from herself, from the day, from the fragile agreement they had signed without ink. In the hallway, she paused at the blue wing. The latch reflected her face as a narrow, fractured slip. She did not try it. She placed her fingers on the cool paint and felt, through wood, the soft electric rumor of a locked heart. She whispered nothing. Some reverence is practiced by quiet. She walked on, into a house that still called itself a cage. The bars had not moved. The gates had not opened. The guards still invented new ways to stand. But somewhere under her ribs, a door had learned the idea of a hinge. It was not freedom. It was a plan. Hate had not died. It had learned a neighbor. Desire had not conquered. It had learned patience. And the girl who had been taken had learned that surviving is not the same as staying untouched. Surviving is choosing what to touch back. From that day after, nothing between them was the same. Not because love had arrived crowned and declared, but because she had held him when the city wanted him gone, and he had bled into her hands without shame. History is written in larger rooms than this, in louder fonts. But the line that mattered most to her was the one no archivist would store. In the aftermath, she remained. The night returned with teeth. The Cuervos had not been defeated, they had been delayed. Wounded animals do not retreat forever. They circle, they wait, they gather strength in silence. Isabella felt it in the marrow of the house. Guards pacing tighter circles. Shadows moving longer against the walls. Dante more silent than ever, as though silence itself had warned him what was coming. She saw it in his eyes one evening, at dinner, in the pause before he raised his glass. His gaze shifted past her, to some horizon she could not see. And in that look, she understood, he was preparing not for peace, but for another storm. The storm arrived with betrayal. It was not the guns that came first, but the absence. A guard missing from his post. A servant disappearing without trace. A door left unlocked. Small fractures, invisible until they cracked wide enough to swallow everything. By the time the alarms rose, it was too late. The Cuervos had already crossed the gates. The mansion erupted. Explosions tore through the eastern wing, glass rained from ceilings, chandeliers collapsed in showers of flame. Smoke thickened the air until breathing became a negotiation. Screams clashed with gunfire, a symphony of destruction conducted without mercy. Isabella ran, but working one run inside a cage. Corridors twisted back into fire, doors opened into ambush, every exit was already claimed. Her heart pounded not with hope of escape, but with the desperate prayer of survival. They found her. They always found her. Hands grabbed her, pulling her into the inferno. She fought, clawed, screamed, but her voice drowned under the roar of collapsing walls. And then she saw it, through the chaos, through the fire, Dante Morello, fighting like a man who had already been condemned. He was everywhere. His presence was not human, it was elemental. Bullets rained, but he carved through them. Blades met him, but his body refused surrender. Every step he took was another Cuervo erased from the world. But this was not war for power. It was not territory. It was not revenge. It was her. Every bullet he fired screamed her name without sound. Every wound he endured was a vow written in flesh. The Cuervos had taken what was his weakness, and he would not forgive them. They dragged Isabella deeper into the burning mansion, using her as bait, as shield, as trophy. She stumbled, coughed blood into the smoke, but refused to collapse. Because she knew he would come. He always came. And he did. He came through fire. Through walls collapsing, through shadows that clawed and screamed. He came with death in his hands and salvation in his eyes. The Cuervos fell before him like candles in a storm. But victory demands a price. When he reached her, when his hands tore her free again, when she fell against him in the ruins of their cage, his body was already breaking. Blood soaked him, deeper than before, more final than before. His breath shuddered as though the air itself had betrayed him. And yet he did not stop. Even wounded, even broken, he pulled her close, shielded her from the last of the fire, carried her through the wreckage of a world that had chosen to end. Only when the final gun fell silent, only when the last Cuervo lay broken in the ashes, only then did his knees give way. They collapsed together on the floor of a burning empire. His head fell against her chest, his blood painting her skin, his eyes fighting to stay open. And Isabella, with tears cutting rivers down her soot-stained face, whispered truths she had denied for too long. She told him she hated him. She told him she loved him. She told them both, because both were true, because both were one. Her voice trembled, cracked, begged him not to leave, begged him to hold on, begged him to listen not to the fire, but to her. And for the first time, Dante Morello smiled, not as a king, not as a monster, not as a man feared by all, but as a man who, for one heartbeat, had been loved. Because sometimes love is not soft. Sometimes love is war. And in the underworld, even in ashes, love can still win. When the night finally ran out of fire, the world did not become gentle. It became quiet. Quiet is not kindness. Quiet is only the absence of everything that was too loud to survive. The mansion smoldered like a creature breathing through pain. Windows wore soot instead of glass. Halls that had staged power now rehearsed defeat. Rugs remembered footfalls, and then forgot them. The portraits, those witnesses painted to outlast storms, stared through a haze that made every century look the same. Somewhere, a lock had melted around a secret it no longer needed to guard. They carried Dante from the ruined heart of the house to a place that did not have his name on the door. Not a hospital, that invites questions, but a building that used to be something else, a school once, then a parish office, now an address for emergencies that prefer to be cured in private. Stairs knew how to hold weight. Doors knew how to open without complaint. Rooms knew how to receive men who arrived between life and legend, trailing both like smoke. Isabella followed. She did not cry in the car. She counted streetlights instead, repeating the numbers because numbers cannot break your heart. At the curb, the night surrendered its damp to her hair, to her clothes, to the ring that still fit too perfectly for a thing she had not chosen. Inside, the air had the clean smell of water that has boiled away everything unnecessary. A woman with tired eyes took a pulse and gave instructions that did not ask for agreement. Men obeyed. Dante obeyed because bodies do when they are busy staying. The room they chose for him had high ceilings and a window too narrow to matter. The bed was stubborn. Machines spoke quietly to one another about blood and pressure and the long labor of returning. He did not wear power here, he wore bandages. Even his shadow learned new edges, thinner and truer. The saint that had lost its face lay on the table, and for the first time it looked less like a relic and more like a confession. Isabella washed her hands in a small sink as if soap knew how to absolve. She tied her hair back with a ribbon that had belonged to a different life. She folded the blanket that would keep him warm and placed it where warmth would listen. She did not say his name. Names wake storms. She said, to herself, the phrase that had carried her through corridors and choices, I am still here. She said it without pride. She said it as inventory. The city beyond the window did what cities do, survived the story that almost ended it. Sirens came and went for other reasons. Shops reopened because bread does not care about epilogues. Somewhere, a child studied spelling words, and somewhere, a dog refused to be persuaded by fireworks. The world reminded her of its stubborn habit, it goes on. The reminder was not cruel. It was simply true. The truth did not change the way her chest hurt. She sat in the chair that had learned the geometry of waiting. There is an art to how a person sits when the future has not chosen a direction. Feet flat, because balance cannot afford drama. Back straight, because collapse suggests conclusions the body cannot yet afford. Hands open, because fists lie. She watched the rise and fall of his breath and learned a new religion that needed no prophet, the faith of counting. Morning found them like a debtor who knows your address. It painted the wall a kind of yellow that does not dare to be joyful. She went out only to find water. On the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar, and beyond it a room that once had been a chapel remembered its task. Someone had taken the pews away. Someone had left the light. The tall window carried the suggestion of saints and colors that had faded into sincerity. In the corner, a brass stand waited for candles that had burned their courage and needed to be replaced. The room smelled of old wood and decisions. Isabella entered because rooms that remember prayers are also rooms where people of no prayers can rest. She did not kneel. Kneeling, for her, belonged to other rituals she had not chosen. She stood and let her eyes climb the tall wall where paint had outlived names. She thought of vows signed in silence. She thought of a dress that had been a chain. She thought of a night that had taught fire to remember them by their first names, and of the ways wait had nearly become the last sentence in a book that did not want to end. What do you ask for when you do not trust wishes? She asked for endurance. She asked for a spine that would not learn new crumples. She asked for a heart that would not forget the difference between surrender and rest. She did not ask for love. Love was already in the room, embarrassing and brave. It had arrived covered in ash and refused to leave. When she returned, he was awake in the narrow way injured men wake, not all at once, but by degrees, like daylight in an alley. The bandage at his side had drunk through the night, a nurse with careful hands fed it new cloth. He found Isabella without turning his head, the way compasses find north even when north is a rumor. Eyes that had learned to order rooms now learned to receive them. In that moment, nothing in him demanded. Everything in him asked. We expect grand speeches at the edge of endings. The truth is simpler. He inhaled. He exhaled. He continued. She set the glass of water where water could be reached and did not make a ceremony of it. He sipped because bodies believe in small salvations. The saint lay on the table and listened with a face it no longer had. They lived like that for days that refused to introduce themselves. The world shrank to the mathematics of healing, temperature, color, appetite, minutes between pain, the slow courage of standing. Men arrived with reports that did not use adjectives. Men left with instructions that did not accept excuses. The name Cuervos dissolved at the edges. The name Morello did not. Empires learn to survive their own fires, just as forests do. New growth is never innocent, but it is real. News trickled like careless rain, an arrest that would not hold, a shipment that would not arrive, a cousin changing sides, a judge pretending not to be scared. Isabella did not pretend to be concerned with these currents. She learned the current of footsteps in the hallway, the difference between a tired shoe and a dangerous one. She learned the sound of machines deciding that yes, today would be another day. At night, the chapel borrowed her. She stood again before the window that had built its own stained glass out of memory and dust. She remembered her parents not as the debts they had become, but as the hands that had made small dinners taste larger. She remembered the little house not as a failure, but as an island that had taught her to swim when the mainland sank. She forgave herself for leaving because staying would have been a different kind of leaving. Choice is not always the ceremony people write about. It is often a quiet, uncelebrated turning of the face toward one road and not another. On the fourth evening, while he slept without fever for the first time, Isabella stepped into the corridor and did not turn toward the exit. She turned back toward his door. She chose not to leave. Not because she was owned. Ownership had nearly died with him and learned, gasping, that it could not breathe in rooms like this. Not because fear held her. Fear had other appointments. Not because the world outside had no arms for her. The world always has arms for those who want to be carried somewhere else. She chose because love, stubborn as a weed and honest as a scar, had grown in the soil of a night when the city burned and two people decided to stand. From the window, morning arrived as if it had been ordered. She sat on the bed beside his hand and allowed her fingers to rest near his. He woke and measured the distance, then closed it without drama. It was not the clasp of captor and captive. It was the handshake two survivors offer each other when they agree to keep walking. It did not erase what had been taken. It did not sanctify what should never be repeated. It was a treaty inked in skin. Later, when he stood for the first time without the room promising to catch him, she was there. He braced on the table, she braced on him. A step. Then another. The body negotiated with gravity and reached terms. The saint swung lightly against his chest, and for a second the metal looked almost like a new face rather than a worn one. Outside, the sky remembered blue. They walked a corridor that had learned how to be merciful by being simple. At the end of it, a door opened to a small courtyard, a rectangle of sky, a stubborn plant, a bench carved by someone who had once believed in benches. Isabella looked up. In that narrow slice of heaven, a bird passed. It did not sing. It simply proved that flight continues. She sat. He sat. The quiet did not accuse them. It accepted them the way oceans accept stones. Isabella's mind returned to the words that had anchored her across chapters she had not chosen. From that night, she was no longer free. She tasted the sentence again and learned it differently. Freedom is not a gate. Freedom is a direction. It is the ability to point yourself where your name feels true. That ability had been stolen, then bartered, then fought for, then salvaged from a fire by hands that learned how to hold without closing. She did not pretend the future would be gentle. Power does not retire, it renegotiates. Enemies do not forgive, they change masks. She and Dante would not live inside a story that ends because endings are for books. They would live inside a city that expects payment for every breath. But the terms had shifted. He no longer mistook possession for love. She no longer mistook hate for armor. In the ledger the world keeps without paper, a new line had been added. Two people will carry each other when the night insists on being heavy. There would be doors she refused to open and rooms he would not enter. There would be arguments fluent in old languages, fear, fury, control, because learning new tongues takes time. There would be days when the ring felt like a brand and days when it felt like a bell. There would be nights when sleep remembered how to be a ceremony and nights when the house, whichever house they chose, remembered how to be a cage. They would leave, if leaving became the only moral verb. They would stay, if staying stopped meaning surrender. On the last afternoon before discharge, she returned to the chapel and lit a candle not for miracles, but for maintenance. Flame is work. It eats to live. She asked for that kind of love, the kind that keeps burning because two people keep feeding it the small twigs of daily courage. She did not bargain. She made a plan, to read again, to write again, to plant 3 things that stubbornly grow: basil in a pot, trust in a wound, light in a hallway. At his bedside, she found him awake, eyes clearer than the new glass that would one day replace windows. He looked at her the way travelers look at water. Not as a prize. As a necessity. She took his hand, and the saint between them knocked gently against bone. What began as fear had become passion. What began as chains had become a different grammar of freedom, the kind that knows its cost and pays it with both hands, together. Because sometimes love is not soft. Sometimes love is war. And when the war ends, love does not go back to sleep. It patrols the perimeter. It tends the garden. It repairs the gate, not to keep the world out, but to teach the house how to welcome without owning. They left by a side door when leaving had finally become continuing. The city did not applaud. It does not know how. But it made room, which is better. The car did not feel like a carriage anymore, it felt like a bridge. Behind them, the building that had been many things kept its quiet. Ahead of them, a street offered choices that looked the same until you decide. Isabella watched the blocks pass and let her heart keep the pace. The ring on her finger was still heavy. She would ask a jeweler to make it lighter, not to erase history, but to make history wearable. Words, she knew now, can carry you across fires if you choose them carefully and repeat them when the smoke reaches your throat. From that night of ashes, nothing between them was the same. Not because the world forgave, not because enemies forgot, not because power grew kind. Because they did the harder thing, they stayed. They learned. They chose. And even in the underworld, where debt names itself destiny and darkness rehearses victory every dusk, some lights refuse to go out.